So good afternoon, everybody. If you could take your seats, I'd like to open this session. I'm sure a few more people will join us, but I think it's time for us to make a start. I really think this is an excellent topic for discussion at this particular moment in time. So I was really very happy that this issue could be accommodated on the conference agenda. Of the world regions, Europe has the most developed and integrated system of conventional arms control, confidence and security building measures. But it's a system that was constructed under very different circumstances from those that we find ourselves in today. The discussions which led to the creation of the system took place against the background of a very real concern about general war in a heavily militarized Europe, but with relatively low levels of violence and a high level of strategic stability. Today we find ourselves in a Europe which actually has historically relatively low levels of militarization, even though some of the things that we thought of as major achievements after the end of the Cold War, such as the major reduction in resources allocated to the military, we begin to see step by step being walked back. Nevertheless, we don't live in a heavily militarized Europe in historical context. I would say there's probably relatively little fear of general war in Europe. But at the same time, we have a conflict in the eastern part of Ukraine, which has now killed 10,000 people, where the risk of escalation and further violence is very real. And we have a number of dangerous flashpoints across Europe, really, where one could only too easily imagine localized conflicts breaking out. So I think this is really an excellent time for reflection. We have an opportunity to change things for the better. We don't need to stay on a trajectory of continuous deterioration in the European security environment. And I thought it was particularly appropriate that they put this session in the creativity and innovation room. So we're looking to our panel for both of these characteristics of creativity and innovation. Now we have an excellent panel. The bios are in the conference app, so we don't need to go through them in detail. But we'll follow the order on the program. So we'll start with Angela Kane, who I think is very well placed, given her past experience, to give us an excellent overview and context for our discussions. Angela.
Thank you very much, Ian, and I'm happy that we captured enough of an audience. I was a bit worried because we have very stiff competition in the other panels. And I also found that when I was looking at the topic and I was Googling a little bit about what's been written about it recently, there really hasn't been very much written. When you Google conventional arms control, you find primarily statements from member states. I find this very interesting because it doesn't seem to capture the attention of maybe academics or the media or something that is really not very much written about it. And I thought that since I'm the only one on the panel with a UN background, I would say a couple of words about what is happening in the UN. I fully realize that that is not exactly where the conventional arms control action is in a dynamic sense. But on the other hand, we heard this morning also from the panelists how important it is to adhere to the agreements that have already been made, that need to be implemented and that need to be adhered to, because maybe we won't have a lot other agreements that are going to be concluded. Now, there are a number of tools for governments to share information within the UN context and thus build trust. And again, the building trust aspect is the one that's underlying all of these arrangements. The first one was agreed to in 1981, and that's the UN report on military establishments. Now, when you look at all of these tools that are existing in the UN, the dismal fact is that very few governments actually use them. There's only voluntary compliance. It is not mandatory. And for example, the UN report on military expenditures in 2016, there were only 43 replies from governments, a very small figure, 20% of all of the member states. Then there's the UN Register of Conventional Arms, which was established 10 years later in 1991. It's reviewed every 3 years because, again, there are new developments in conventional arms, there are new achievements, there are new weapons that are coming out that need to be looked at. But on the other hand, Annually, there are about 60 countries that report, a little bit more, but still not enough. Then there's the Program of Action on the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons, and that was established in 2001. And it really does lay the foundation for action at the national, regional, and global levels, and is complemented by a separate instrument on tracing illicit arms, small arms, that was concluded in 2005. There are also other factors. There are like ammunition guidelines, the UN Safer Guard, and the International Small Arms Controls standards. And then there are the treaties. And the treaties are, for example, the 1983 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which 123 states have joined, the 1999 Convention on the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines, the so-called Mine Ban Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions in 2010 with 100 states parties, and the Arms Trade Treaty, which entered into force in 2014 and now has 86 state parties. This machinery is reviewed every year in the Disarmament Commission and the First Committee. But I must admit to you, and I think you know that the review is very static. It's the resolutions that are adopted on these particular topics do not change much from year to year. And in addition, the Security Council also reviews it, and they receive a report on small arms and light weapons every other year. And when did you hear the last time that the Security Council took a dynamic action on small arms and light weapons? You didn't. Well, but on the other hand, in 2015, for the very first time, the Security Council actually adopted a resolution on the issue. There were 31 operative paragraphs, I think it's like 7 or 8 pages. And the Council encouraged, it urged, it called upon member states to address the illicit transfer of small arms. And while this was an important step in supporting the conventional arms framework and its CBM measures, it did not really result in, again, other negotiating aspects that could be picked up on by member states. It was more of an exhortative supporting measure than anything else. But let me put the conventional arms control issue in a broader context. As I mentioned, the UN instruments are to be complied with voluntarily, and the compliance, as I also said, has been very low. And actually it's been going down rather than increasing. There is definitely a reporting fatigue because more and more instruments have come up that need to be reported to and complied with, or rather voluntarily complied with. And there's a sense, and I must also say that that is very prevalent these days, that transparency is not always desirable as security diminishes. And as Ian has already mentioned, there's a dramatic change in the security landscape in Europe, and rather than being relegated to the back burner, conventional arms control needs reinvigorated efforts. We must always remember that the conventional arms control issues really started during the Cold War confrontation in Europe. It was negotiated in the last years of the then still the regime, and then basically it was a hostile environment, and actually some of the treaties like the CFE, etc., the Open Skies, actually came into force once the wall had already fallen. But I think that despite the inauspicious timing of when the conventional arms control was started, it developed into one of the pillars, a very strong pillars of cooperative security order that replaced political divisions and military confrontations. I'm not going to go into the details of the historical developments because we want to be also forward-looking and maybe be a little creative rather than backward-looking. I just want to say that when you look at what happened in Europe, you have to think about the NATO's enlargement in '99, the joining of the Baltic states, which actually Ambassador Rogov brought out this morning, and that brought NATO into a territory directly bordering Russia, and one that was not subject to legally binding arms limitations. Russia suspended its participation in the CFE until 2007, and while this was seen by others as a step in the wrong direction, it is unclear how vigorous the efforts were made to engage Russia in reversing the course. The recognition of Kosovo as a state independent of Serbia in 2008, the offensive by Georgia against South Ossetia and Russian peacekeepers in the same year fueled Russian suspicions that the US and NATO was engaging in a geopolitical zero-sum game that threatened Russian security interest. And the Ukraine crisis was probably the last straw that set off Russia's annexation to Crimea. As I said, Moscow suspended its implementation of the CFE treaty in 2007. In March 2015, it completely ended activities. Now, the crisis in Ukraine has led to an increased use of the provisions of these 3 pillars, but it has also shown its limitations. At the OSCE in Vienna, crisis measures were triggered, inspections and verifications were carried out, but not all requests for actions or meetings resulted in cooperation. And I think you, Anthony, stated in the yearbook of 2015 that Russia did not provide all the information and did not attend all the meetings. But what we have seen, and that's very important, is that the OSCE has proven and a permanent dialogue structures which can look back on a comprehensive array of joint decisions and security arrangements. What happened in August of this year I consider very important, and that is when the German chairman in office, Foreign Minister Steinmeier, published an op-ed in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, and he entitled it "More Security for Everyone in Europe, a call for a relaunch of arms control." Despite Russia's violation of basic principles of peace, Steinmeier made a tangible offer of cooperation, and I stress tangible. He said, "Our world has become more dangerous and we must be united in our interest to avoid spiraling escalation. Not to try such an undertaking," he argued, "would be irresponsible." And he listed 5 areas that a relaunch of conventional arms control had to cover, and invited a structured dialogue with all partners who share responsibility for the security of Europe. And such a dialogue, he proposed, should take place within the OSCE. Now, more than 2 months have passed since Steinmeier's appeal. His proposal has been debated in a like-minded group, and a ministerial statement has been contemplated, but has not yet been agreed upon. It is clear that a renewed debate or negotiations on conventional arms control need to be initiated, and with the OSCE as the most obvious forum. We've heard this morning about the recent discussion at the UN about a ban on nuclear weapons, which was strongly opposed by the nuclear possessor states and those under the nuclear umbrella. And you also heard that the reason was an uncertain security environment, which is, to my mind, all the more reason to address conventional arms control as a priority, to eliminate one of the factors in the debate. Ambassador Robov spoke this morning about the conventional weapons and the fact that the Soviet Union had superiority in conventional weapons in the past, but did not have it any longer. And deterrence is a determining factor in conventional superiority, so that clearly needs to be addressed also in the context of nuclear weapons. So what we have right now is stagnation and deterioration on the diplomatic stage. The dialogue focuses, and I'm sure that Adam will talk about this much more, in the OSCE on negative public statements, on military reinforcement measures, but not, at least not visibly, on searching for cooperative solutions that could also include sub-regional arms control measures and CBMs to enhance transparency. What we're seeing is a dramatically increased level of military exercises and a reinforced military presence in the region. And that is really bringing me to the final question, that is, what is the role of conventional arms control in this difficult security landscape? The nature of conflict has really changed from large operations to asymmetrical and hybrid warfare, particularly as we look at the use of new technologies and cyber operations that we also heard about earlier today. There's a new generation of arms control regimes that are not oriented against states, but they are functionally directed and are primarily a response to the threats of nuclear terrorism or humanitarian concerns. I would call for a reassessment not only of the current security landscape, but also of the nature of the use of conventional arms, taking a holistic approach that should start with smaller steps like sub-regional arms control and CBMs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that excellent introduction to the discussion. Yes, fully deserved. I'd like to give the floor next to Adam Kobiratsky, and of course it's for you to make your own remarks, but the discussion of the relaunch of conventional arms control kind of makes me think of the discussions going on in the room next door about space. In order for the rocket to launch successfully, we need to have a stable platform. I'd be really interested in your view on whether or not this stable platform for launch and negotiations actually exists at the moment, or whether it's something that needs to be created But as I say, the floor is yours.
Thank you. The direct answer to your question is no, it does not exist at the moment. It needs to be built. However, before I go into the details, Angela said that in this panel she's unique because of her UN experience, which is true. But I was desperately trying to think what can make me unique in this panel. Definitely it's not NATO experience, it's not the OSCE experience, but there is one thing. I'm the only one on this panel who graduated from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations some time ago, but that's the fact. Now, talking about conventional arms control, first of all, when you talk about it today, we should keep in mind that terminology matters. When we say conventional arms control, we really have to explain what we mean. Definitely, conventional arms control in Europe is not conventional disarmament, full stop, as simple as this. It's very different from the terminology used both during the plenary and in parallel sessions. Second, also terminological problem is when Minister Steinmeier, Angela, when you say that there's time to relaunch arms control, what do you mean by relaunching arms control? You mean starting or restarting formal negotiations? If that's the case, it's mission impossible today. Do you think that it's time to look at the issue and to prepare the launching pad, if you wish, for future endeavors? Yes, it's time to do it. It's time to think and discuss conventional arms control, but not in the sense of starting formal or informal, doesn't matter, negotiations. There are no political conditions for arms control negotiations in Europe today. Arms control does not take place, never took place in a political vacuum. And today, arms control, understood as kind of hardware arms control. When people say conventional arms control in Europe, most of us think about CFE-like arrangements or CFE regime or this type of arrangements. Now, if that's the case, then once more, arms control understood as a set of limits, standards, plus verification, plus information exchange, but some limits on military potential, of course is badly needed in Europe, but at the same time, today, it is mission impossible for political reasons. And to be more specific, for reasons like the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, just rebuild and modernize Russian military potential, the number of ongoing, rather protracted, frozen conflicts in the OSCE area, then terrorist threats, and frankly, the level of political confrontation between Russia and the West. Now, once more, there are different, when we discussed, I was actually one of the CFE negotiators, both during the original negotiation, then through the adaptation talks. Back in Vienna, when we were talking about arms control, we always had in mind that it might be hardware, CFE type, or software, which is basically confidence and security building measures, and all kinds of measures which increase military transparency, military predictability, confidence, but do not put limits on the size of military potentials. This was the essence of the hardware approach. Now, so if the question will be, what arms control instruments can be considered today, I would say that that one should look at those possible instruments or instruments for possible consideration at two levels. First, regional level. And at the regional level, we badly need some kind of stabilizing crisis management measures, the kind of things that we actually try to introduce in Donbass, and they don't work. I stopped already counting how many times the Trilateral Contact Group agreed on the new parameters for moving military equipment from the contact line, and then the implementation always fails. But there is a need to think about ways to stabilize, to think about crisis management measures that may help to stabilize, be it ongoing or protracted conflicts. Now, by the way, in the OSCE archives, we have negotiated everything in the 90s. Was it 92 that we adopted a paper, very important document at that time, stabilizing measures for localized crisis situations.
1993.
Free. Sorry, you remember better the date. I was chairman of that working group. So
That's why.
I forget the date. Now, the thing is, when SMM, when Special Monitoring Mission, is now looking at what kind of things they can do to stabilize the situation around the line of contact, they come to the same conclusions as we did more than 20 years ago. Stabilizing measures, cantonment of weapons, things like that. But the problem with those regional stabilizing measures is they can hardly be considered or implemented without political will. So we may sit and discuss them, but this will be more theoretical discussion, because a sine qua non condition here is a political will, a kind of conducive political environment for going that way. But then, which is closer to the subject of this session, there are some arms control instruments, conventional arms control instruments, that can be considered at the Europe-wide level. I would say that there are two clusters here. First of all, it is high time to restart real dialogue on military aspects of security. People refer to the ongoing security dialogue in the OSCE. For the 4 years between 2011 and 2015, I was the director of the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center. Believe me, the kind of dialogue between Russian and Ukrainian and NATO delegations, actually EU delegations, every week during the permanent council meeting, whenever we discuss Ukraine, you can hardly call it a security dialogue. It's a series of statements, serious political statements, but it's not security dialogue. That's why I'm saying you need to restart this, because we need to talk about possible fixes, solutions, arrangements, and not just, this political debate is needed, but it needs to be complemented by security dialogue. And this security dialogue, first of all, the only forum for this kind of activity is the OSCE. It's the best forum to do it. But then what kind of issues might be put on the agenda? First of all, threat perceptions. That's where we differ with Russians. That's the narrative of the last quarter of a century, what happened during the last 25 years, and what kind of things we see as threatening today. Second, whatever is linked to military intentions. I can't understand really why OSCE is not organizing a seminar on military doctrines once a year or once every 6 months. Today, this should be a kind of a permanent dialogue. Because, by the way, one of the side effects of the certain fiasco of conventional arms control in Europe is also the fact that we lost, over the last few years, the culture of military-to-military cooperation, which we developed late 90s and late 90s rather. It's gone with the wind. It does not exist anymore. And we have to make sure that militaries start to talk to each other once again. So this is about security dialogue. And now the second kind of cluster of issues is that we can try at least to develop this software, existing software of conventional arms control in Europe through the development of confidence and security building measures, Vienna document, and through, if necessary, modification, but at least we should try to keep open skies regime. Now, Angela and you, I think, referred to that already. During the early stage of Crimea crisis, and then when the war in Donbass started, actually, some confidence security building measures were used by OSCE participating states, by NATO states, and open skies flights were used. It's true that the Russian Federation did not, at that time, provide all the information that Moscow should have provided under the terms of the Vienna document. Nevertheless, the measures were there and were used. And in the hot stage of this crisis, sometimes even the negative information from the Russian Federation was already something to interpret by our military. I remember sitting in Vienna as a director of the CPC and getting every day actually photos from one of my collaborators who was accompanying the group of Vienna document inspectors trying to get to Crimea through this road, through this train, or maybe that one, or maybe that one. At least they spotted where the border posts were being erected at that time. So yes, this is both negative experience in the sense that Russia did not implement fully or did not meet all her commitments under the Vienna document. Nevertheless, the measures were there. And it's the same with Open Skies. Open Skies flight were actually used by several OSCE states. One may also think about discussing in more details in the OSCE the issue of how to avoid military incidents. There was an idea to, and there were even some proposals or suggestions to take up this issue between as an issue, first of all, between Russia and NATO. So put it on the agenda of the NRC. Now, the moment we put it on the agenda of the NRC, we politicize the issue and to make the discussions much more difficult politically. The moment we open this discussion in the OSCE, in whichever format the OSCE, Forum for Security Cooperation, PC, doesn't matter, then it's, first of all, it applies to everybody, and to the best of my memory, Sweden is not a member of NATO yet and has some problems with some hazardous incidents in the Baltic Sea. And it's kind of less politicized. It's more focused, could be or should be more focused on the substance. So altogether, I would say that I would strongly disagree with the statement that time is ripe now to relaunch arms control negotiations or conventional arms control negotiations in Europe. At the same time, I would strongly agree with the statement that it's high time to relaunch arms control in Europe in the sense of developing, building on the experience that we already have, developing existing software, developing CSBMs, keeping Open Skies, and maybe opening discussions on how to avoid military incidents. Plus, we should at least try to make sure that what was meant as security dialogue in the OSCE is actually security dialogue and not just a series of political statements. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that gives us a huge amount of new food for thought for our discussion, which will begin immediately after the next presentation by Wolfgang Richter. It's already been mentioned that one of the factors which has put a certain amount of new momentum into this issue is the publication of the article by Foreign Minister Steinmeier. So I think it would be extremely interesting to also understand, in addition to whatever else Wolfgang wants to say, to try to understand a little bit about the context of why this was put forward now and what the objectives are from a German perspective. So, Wolfgang.
Thank you very much, Ian. You have asked me to explain a little bit the context and the context for the Steinmeier initiative and the intention. When I do that from a German perspective, let me stress from the beginning, and it's my first disclaimer, I do not speak for the German government. Full stop. The second disclaimer is the two previous speakers have made my task very difficult because I'm afraid I will not present very controversial views.
Sorry.
Okay. We are discussing relaunching or whatever, reinvigorating conventional arms control against the backdrop of probably the worst security crisis in Europe we had since the Cold War. What we are observing was already very well described, diverging narratives about the causes of the conflict, contradicting perceptions of the political intent behind changing force postures and military activities of both the Russian Federation and NATO countries. And this has poisoned the political atmosphere in Europe and led to a sense of a new confrontation. Increased military activities, such as forward stationing of forces, large-scale maneuvers, snap exercises, reconnaissance flights, and show of force in international sea and airspace have fueled new threat perceptions. They also harbor the risk of misjudgment and escalation resulting from brinkmanship and unintended hazardous incident. In this tense situation, the lack of cooperative security measures that work, and here's the difference, maybe a little bit to what you said, Adam, has most serious implications. In this context, we have probably to acknowledge, and we might now regret, that the pillars of the European security order as agreed in the 1990s have been eroding long before the Ukraine conflict. And I'm here referring to the principles and to the instruments of strategic restraint and security cooperation. Today, such instruments are either not observed or not sufficiently suited to stabilize the situation, de-escalate tensions, and hedge in conflicts, or they are missing at all. This is particularly true for conventional arms control. The CFE treaty, which was once labeled, I quote, the cornerstone of European security, has become inadequate to stabilize a changing security landscape in Europe, and attempts to adapt the treaty in 1999 or to relaunch conventional arms control from scratch in the years 2010 and 11 have failed. This is probably not the place to give a detailed account why adaptation or relaunch efforts failed, but we have to realize that the key problems, the obstacles, have not yet been overcome, and probably they have even been aggravated. Just to enumerate some. First, there was a principal dispute about Russia's prior fulfillment of the so-called Istanbul commitments, referring to the withdrawal of forces from Moldova and Georgia. Second, after 2001, for some states, arms control has become less urgent and was deemed an element of political bargaining rather than a pillar of common security. So as ACFE ratification, ACFE stands here for the adaptation agreement for the CFE treaty, were made subject to achieving further political ends, and Russia in December 2007, as Angela pointed out already, suspended the old treaty of 1990. The third point, disputes over missile defense, the independence of breakaway regions, military interventions in Europe and beyond, signaled an emerging new geopolitical rivalry between Russia and the West, with probably the Russian annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Ukraine leading to the nadir of the European security order. And fourth, and this is an obstacle which I would like to stress before we start talking about relaunch negotiations, these disputes have generated controversies on principles, such as the host nation consent requirement for the stationing of foreign troops, and more generally the adherence to basic norms of international law, such as the principles of non-intervention in internal affairs and the prohibition of the threat or use of force. This development resulted in most serious consequences for military postures in Europe and the attempts to adapt or revive conventional arms control or to modernize OSCE CSPMs. While NATO decided to reassure Eastern European allies by improving crisis response and enhancing its forward presence, Russia is currently reinforcing forward stationing of forces, particularly along the Russian-Ukrainian border. There is a risk that sub-regional stability might deteriorate further, resulting from growing mistrust and an increased desire to respond to each other's military action along the perceived new front lines. In the most sensitive areas of tension, stabilizing limitations and intrusive information and verification regimes are missing, given that NATO member states have not ratified ACFE, Russia has suspended CFE, and the Baltic states have not acceded to both. Was also not possible, of course. After the failure of the ACFE, the way back to the obsolete CFE regime is blocked for political and conceptual reasons, while increased military activities, in particular SNAP exercises, to a large extent escape transparency rules of the Vienna document. And here I do not speak about arms control within conflict zones. The modernization of the Vienna document is blocked as well because of linkages to the overall security situation and the blockade of conventional arms control. So it is in this context of growing tensions and mutual threat perceptions and blockades in which arms control as a meaningful measure of military restraint is most needed and at the same time most difficult to achieve. In my interpretation, this is the basic assessment underlying the proposal made by German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier to relaunch arms control in Europe. He said, he didn't say negotiations, by the way, Adam. He said to relaunch arms control in Europe as a tried and tested means of risk reduction, transparency, and confidence building, no matter how deep the rifts are. It is his conviction that otherwise, given the manifold crises and the risk of escalation, peace in Europe and beyond will be fragile. One might argue that securing military restraint through conventional arms control belongs to the agreed acquis and fundamental pillars of the OSCE security order. In times of crisis, it is an urgently needed stability measure, and one might call it confrontation management rather than business as usual, as was pointed out by NATO headquarters. What is certainly not intended is undermining NATO's Warsaw Summit decisions or the capabilities for individual or collective defense. In contrast, restricting offensive military capabilities, which could be used for large-scale or surprise cross-border operations, was and is the basis, the basic rationale, let's say, for conventional arms control. Starting a new conventional arms control process in Europe in times of crisis, and here I agree fully with Adam's interpretation, requires states to agree on a common purpose and ideally renew political commitment to strategic restraint and cooperative security in the OSCE area. There should be, however, no illusion that such definition of a common objective could be achieved overnight, let alone a negotiation mandate. What is needed next, as a next step, is a structured dialogue about threat perceptions and options for militarily relevant arrangements to lower the risk of escalation and create more predictability and stability of the military situation. Let me add another note of caution. Discussions on principles will be necessary at a certain point in time. Consensus might be achievable regarding the undiminished validity of international norms and OSCE principles if done in a generic way. However, discussions about their concrete application, in particular in the areas of conflict, will certainly lead to sharp controversies and, as in the past, bog down the process from the very beginning. And this is particularly true if this interpretation is tied to the initiation of talks on substance as a precondition. In contrast, it should be clarified that arms control cannot solve territorial conflicts. However, it can provide for a secure and transparent environment which is indispensable for negotiating peaceful solutions and preventing the parties involved from resorting to violence. A positive pan-European security environment is certainly better suited to solving territorial conflicts than insisting on confrontational and irreconcilable arguments and producing another stalemate. To that end, a new arms control approach should refrain from prejudging eventual political solutions and establishing respective political linkages. Finally, new arms control should not serve as to drive another wedge into the European security landscape. Rather than perpetuating the political divide of Europe, a new concept should have the potential to promote the OSCE objective of security cooperation without geopolitical zero-sum games. That is why a new arms control process should look also beyond the NATO-Russia context. Therefore, exploratory talk should be principally open-ended, probably in the OSCE format, but guided by a core group of like-minded countries that have a vested and genuine interest in a new pan-European arms control regime. They could carry and steer the process and promote ways out of stalemates that might be caused by individual linkages to further political objectives. Obviously, this is also the understanding of the German chair of the group of like-minded countries, which was established in September. The OSCE chair could carry on the initiative and work in parallel with states and collective defense organizations towards a political and military framework for future conventional arms control arrangements in Europe. And as a first step, the OSCE Ministerial Council in Hamburg on the 8th and 9th of December could produce, let me say very humbly, some positive noise to that end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's hope that you're right about the positive outcome of the ministerial. So I'd like to open the floor now to questions, interventions, which can be general or can be targeted at individuals on the panel. So please, if you could also, two words, identify yourself. This is very helpful for the colleagues from IISS who are preparing the transcript. And there should be a mic available, I think, for... Okay, if there's no mic, we won't slow down and wait for one, but if you could identify yourself now.
I'm Mariana Bujarin, I'm with the Harvard Kennedy School, and my question to all panelists really, thank you very much, first of all, for the excellent presentations. Each one of you has mentioned Russia as a major partner or interlocutor in any potential conventional arms control measures. But we don't have a Russian on the panel to speak for the Russian side. If you had to guess what could be any potential incentives at this time for the Russian Federation to engage in any security dialogue on the conventional arms control, given what we know about the present Russian regime, given what we understand about their geopolitical ends, given their perceptions of conventional inferiority versus NATO, what would at all drive Russians to a security dialogue table?
Okay, I'll collect 2 or 3 questions and then come back to the panelists rather than having many questions in one round at the end. So next was Lars-Erik Lundin.
Lars-Erik Lundin, going even further back, Adam, to the starting of the CSPM regime as such, 1983-84. We are now very lucky in one way. In those days, we were unable to have any kind of dialogue, even informal dialogue. It took us over 2 years to agree on the format for the negotiations, even if we knew more or less the parties and the parameters that we were looking for, militarily significant parameters. Now we're in a completely different ballgame, however. We have many possibly new parameters that have been mentioned by Minister Steinmeier, and it would seem to me that in parallel to states talking with each other, there would be a need for a much more rich informal dialogue, both between states and researchers, the way we are having it right now. I think we are, in a sense, in a completely new ballgame in that way, that it's a much more complex security landscape than we had at that time, and the seriousness of the measures that we are talking about as well. Having worked 8 years at the table of the Permanent Council in Vienna, I can testify as Adam as that it's completely useless to have the dialogue at the table there. You need to find informal ways to talk. And in fact, I believe there are such informal ways existing in Vienna between ambassadors. But of course, you need to broaden it also to the non-governmental community. So you need to find, I think, several parallel ways to move ahead here. And the format is interesting. Colonel Richter mentioned the fact that we need to move beyond NATO Warsaw Pact, for instance. Well, this was exactly the discussion we had already in the mid-80s, where I, as a Swedish negotiator, was instructed to say in Bonn that we wanted to have the neutral and non-aligned countries in. And later, when I met my colleague, Ambassador Gruber in Belgrade in 1996, he agreed with me that it wouldn't have been that bad to have Yugoslav around the table, also in the CFE talks. So again, the format, it needs to be considered, and I wonder if you have a view on the format for these, the formal format for these negotiations, whenever they take place.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. So actually, the next question was, yes, exactly. No, behind you. It's not you, behind you.
I don't usually use the microphone, those who know me. John Gower, formerly Ministry of Defence of the United Kingdom, responsible for conventional arms control amongst other things. This panel has obviously concentrated and concerned itself with a NATO-Russia theatre of conventional arms control, but clearly that's because of your backgrounds. So I have two questions that sort of comes from that. Firstly, do the panel members agree that the principles of conventional arms control and confidence building measures are global, and that there may be lessons both from the experience in Europe for other theatres, or there may be experiences from other theatres that could inform a regeneration of the European? And the second one is really to open up the window a little bit. We heard this morning that there are emerging high-end discrete conventional capabilities whose reach, speed and precision will be capable of strategic effect on an adversary, and particularly risk-affecting strategic stability with nuclear adversaries. Does the panel agree that there's a need for further regimes like the Missile Technology Control Regime looking at these high-end conventional capabilities and also bringing in offensive cyber capabilities, because both of these could be incredibly destabilizing, either in the nuclear theatre or elsewhere, and are essentially conventional arms? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do now is return to the panelists for some response. I have a list of speakers, so if you haven't been called on yet, it doesn't mean that you've been ignored or neglected. But I'd like to give the opportunity, perhaps in reverse order, for people to pick up the issues that they want to respond to. So, Wolfgang?
Yeah, thank you. First, to the Russia response. I mean, I guess we have, at least in the audience, one Russian who could say something about it, but I don't want him to put him on the spot. I just read what one of probably his superiors has said on the Steinmeier initiative in the General Assembly. It was Mr. Ulyanov. He said, "We understand that this initiative was dictated by a realization of the danger of the European security situation descending to a state characteristic of the Cold War area. If this is the case, then, in our opinion, the proposal merits thorough analysis. Even so, there are plenty of snakes in this area that complicate the prospect for any agreements being reached. Russia remains open to dialogue." And then he added, but he is very curious how NATO allies would respond to the German initiative. That was a little bit an irony behind it. So, in other words, there seems to be a political will to engage, but there is no will to initiate an engagement, because Russia initiated several proposals up to 2011, and since they didn't fly, I have my personal interpretation is there is a certain sense of frustration in Moscow, and also a turn away from arms control efforts towards, let's say, military means. But that doesn't mean that they are not open for dialogue. But maybe they felt a long time it's hopeless. If that initiative could make them feel it's not that hopeless that they thought, it might be worthy to explore. The other point is, that was discussed this morning already, Russia knows, of course, that they are conventionally inferior. If you look at the European and global theater, they might be not inferior if you, let's say, shrink the region to a certain sub-region, or to two certain sub-regions where they have a certain leverage and could maybe apply more forces in a short time. So that on the parameters, I think it is quite clear that a new bloc-to-bloc approach would not work for arms control. And looking beyond NATO and Russia relations is absolutely correct. In the past, it was CFE was basically a NATO Warsaw Pact enterprise. It was based on 17 years of not useless, but not, if not, let's say, effective negotiations on arms control, and finally that was MBFR. And then all the discussions made and the experiences made then could be taken over to the mandate for the CFE treaty finally when the time was right. And I think that we have to take it to have in mind that first you have to have a framework, a political framework, and a sense for what should be regulated in military terms. and then you start discussing a mandate, and then you start then you have the basis for negotiations. And this is a process that takes years. So nobody, also not in Germany, has believed that with a certain initiative or an article in a newspaper, you start negotiations tomorrow. That is a total misinterpretation, I feel. The OSCE should be the roof, and I think my Swedish colleague is quite right. Other states that are not NATO member states, or not yet, I don't know what I should say here, should be part of the process. And if you look at the 16 states that are now have been convened in 2 sessions already, I think it is quite clear that there are Western and Eastern European states, EU states, NATO countries, neutral countries. So I guess Sweden is well represented there. The third one is what John said about NATO-Russia relations as a center of the negotiations. Yes, the principles, of course, apply globally. I think nobody took this into question. And we should, of course, apply the lessons learned for other regions. That is quite a good idea. I remember when I was posted to the United Nations that Pakistan, for some while in the 90s, always requested a General Assembly resolution on applying a CFE-type regime in the Indian subcontinent. Before one can spill over, so to speak, or try to apply these lessons learned to other continents, we should make sure, as Europeans, that this regime works in Europe. If we produce failure, what can we advertise for? On the other question of the content of new conventional arms control, let me make a note of caution. Of course, there are new elements of war. Cyber, there was a question of drones, there is maybe the more important question of networks or net-centric warfare, etc. That has limits, because if we want to put everything in one regime, we will probably fail from the very beginning. Just to make the point on the net-centric warfare. Net-centric warfare relies basically on not on the bigger firepower of smaller units, but on the connection or on the net that smaller units links to far away, long-range, very precise weapons, from a cruiser with cruise missiles to a small unit somewhere in another region. Though this is net-centric warfare, but it is based on certain capabilities which are probably not the real matter for conventional arms control. For example, space, satellites, orbits, computers, etc. So one should be realistic on that. It has to be taken into account. This is the background. And we always failed also in the past. I was negotiating on the opposing side, by the way, we failed always when we tried to have a qualitative approach that goes too far. So one should be realistic and achieve something. The best is the enemy of the good here.
Okay, thank you. Adam.
Thank you. Possible incentives for Russian Federation to get engaged in arms control. If there is anything that Russian military experts are really afraid of, these are not 4 battalions that, in accordance with some decision, will be deployed in Central and Eastern Europe. This is missile defense in Poland, in Romania and Poland, because Sergei Rogov explained it a bit today, but it goes a bit beyond what Rogov said today, because under the Russian view is missile defense, if deployed in Europe, in Central Europe, and if then developed further, it could disturb what Russian generals see as a strategic balance between Russia and US. So this is absolute, but I'm not suggesting to include missile defense in conventional arms control. I'm just reacting to your question. This is a possible incentive. Whatever confidence building around missile defense, this may serve as an incentive. Plus, Russian military would always insist on, inclusion in the new agenda, if there will be one, for arms control, on the inclusion of high precision conventional weapons. That's something they're really afraid of. Drones, things like that. What what might be the best format for informal negotiation. Well, chairman in office is always free. I mean, I would leave this issue with the chairman in office of the OSCE. It would be up to the chairmanship to, find even different formats for different issues. But Lars-Erik, your point about more informal dialogue, of course, it would be. I mean, the more the more players you have, it will be probably easier to understand the issues, but much more difficult to agree. So informal dialogue might be a good starting point, but not just informal dialogue. Whether principles of arms control, conventional arms control in Europe and CSBMs are global or not, I would say, it depends at which level we speak, because a principle that military transparency helps to stabilize the situation, yes, that's true. Whether, in order to increase military transparency, one would need multilateral mechanisms to exchange military information, I would say it's European solution. Whether it would work in Latin America, I have no idea. I just remember when I was a young diplomat, just appointed Polish ambassador in Vienna to the OSCE and UN back in '97. I had a visitor from Colombia, a Colombian ambassador who insisted on coming, and he came finally to get a lecture from me about the way we do conflict prevention in Europe, because they wanted to establish a Latin American version of conflict prevention center. To the best of my knowledge, it didn't happen yet. And just one more thing. High-end conventional capabilities should be covered. Listen, we're talking about a relatively modest, although extremely difficult, arms control effort, possible arms control effort in Europe. The more global we go, the more difficult is the issue. That's one of the reasons for which I said CFE-type arrangements in Europe are impossible today. There are too many things that would need to be covered. So I don't know the answer to your question, but once more, high-end conventional capabilities, this is potentially an incentive for the Russian military.
Okay, Angela,
Yeah.
I'd like to get in another round of questions.
Thank you,
Brief.
thank you. Well, I do want to get my 2 cents in
Yeah, of
here.
course,
And
of course,
basically,
of course,
they were very interesting questions, and I think the major incentive for getting involved, both on the Russian and the European side, is that geography is not going to change. I mean, Europe and Russian Federation are going to be neighbors, as we are and have been. There's also mutual dependency. Just if you think of my own country, Germany, and other countries as well, being dependent on the Russian Federation for energy supplies. This is not going to change. There are lots of reasons of why it is. But what I basically see, and those of us who have been around for a long time and who have looked at the situation, is remember the neo-abroad, the Russian concern about the neo-abroad? And if you think what happened with Romania and Poland and the stationing, and if you think about what's happened with the Baltics, and we've already talked about that, I think this is something that you cannot just dismiss out of hand. And the other thing that I've said, and I've spent a lot of time in negotiations, not particularly between the Russian Federation and the US, is that there is a matter of national pride. I think that there's a very strong feeling that all of the Russian concerns, and they've raised them repeatedly, have been dismissed out of hand. If you think about the differences in interpretation of how the treaties and agreements are implemented, there are differences, and the Russian Federation has said, you have not complied or whatever, or the US has sort of said, you, Russia, have not complied. But there are differences that need to be talked about, and I don't know, I cannot see that they've actually been talked about. But there are instances where the US and Russia, and I'm limiting it to those two now, have worked very well together. And just think about the Iran agreement, just think about the chemical issue on Syria. I'm not talking about the humanitarian delivery and all of this, what happened recently, but I have seen it in 2013 and in the year and a half that followed with the actually the delivery of the chemical weapons and the destruction of chemical weapons, where there was very good cooperation between the Russian Federation. I do agree that it needs to be taken out of the NATO, I mean, Warsaw Pact doesn't really exist anymore, context. I think that is extremely important. But I think the first thing that has to happen is that people sit down and sort of say, what do we actually disagree on? What are actually the bones of contention? What are actually the points where we don't overlap? And why is that? I think some of the treaties are a little bit, and I'm not a lawyer, but maybe they are open to interpretation. And I think that's where you really have to start and say, let's look at those areas first and see whether we cannot either narrow it down or make it a bit more concrete, is where you see violations and where we don't see violations. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I have a list already of people who've asked. Yes, I have you on the list. So I think it was Plum and Panther who was next. Yeah.
Thank you. Plamen Pantev. I'm director of the Institute for Security and International Studies in Sofia, Bulgaria. Two notes first. I think the more actual part of the title of this panel is Pressing Security Challenges. Second note, I would not agree with the wording or the thinking that NATO's enlargement to the Baltic states, which directly border the Russian Federation, should be read as a threat to the Russian Federation. This is the Russian story. I think that the EU enlargement is no less dangerous from the point of view of the Russian Federation. And I don't think this is the thinking of the people, not only in the Baltic states, but in Eastern Europe in general. And a note which I feel obliged to comment, which is very correct. The Russian frustration, there is Russian frustration. One of the sources of this frustration is that something was spoiled in the bilateral Russian-US relations. Listening this morning to Dr. Rogov, I was reminded of an article which some 10 years ago he wrote in Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Star. That's the newspaper of the Russian armed forces, in which his interpretation of the ballistic missile defense was not that dangerous at that time because, according to him, there has been time enough for negotiations. And I heard today the several ifs, as already said, before it becomes really threatening to the Russian Federation from a military point of view.
I don't know if you have a question, Plamen, but if you could come to conclusion.
This is not a question. This is my trying to answer something about the incentives. It's difficult to have common objective and strategic restraint when the Russian Federation is presently carrying out its operation of recreating its superpower say in world affairs by reliance on influential military engagement. This is my. Also, we miss in our analysis how the arms control policy or the disarmament policy of the Russian Federation is influenced by the domestic developments in Russia.
These are well taken points, but we
finally,
must be finally.
Yes. Finally, I would not agree as a representative of a small country in Eastern Europe with the thinking that having more territory as strategic depth or part of a sphere of influence is agreeable, and arms control negotiations are something secondary after this. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, question in the front.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
I think it's on. Yep.
Good. And thank you, our presenters, esteemed presenter, for very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. My name is Alexander Vorontsov. I'm from Russia, and from Institute of Oriental Studies of Russian Academy of Sciences. And I would like to join to the question of my Canadian colleague. I understood better than before now that Russia is only one sources of all kinds of troubles, headaches for Europe and in Europe. And therefore, as esteemed Mr. Ambassador told, arms control is impossible now. But what the conclusion? to wait and see policy continue? If no dialogue, what we will have instead? Unlimited arms race, unlimited military presence increasing along both sides of border. Is it will be better? I'm not specialist in this kind of question. I'm specialist in Korean problem, and my session will be next. But a little bit amazing for me is that I found that some parallels in our discussions, because today Madame Mogherini stressed the North Korean case, and even in respect with North Korea, she stressed that the restoration of dialogue and engagement policy is necessary now, because previous period of the policy where only sticks, no carrot, resulted in considerable aggravation security situation on Korean Peninsula and the region. So if we will have no dialogue, what we will have? And I understand very well. There were very interesting explanation and facts and considerations, some samples. I understand very well that the dialogue will be and is very, very difficult and very, very hard. But there is well-known classic diplomatic formula that even the most hopeless negotiations are better than absence of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. And final question on the far side before we come back to the panel. There's lots of people. There's not going to be time.
Thank you. My name is Heinz Gärtner. I'm academic in Vienna. When I talk to officials and experts in Vienna for years, they said conventional arms control is dead. There will be no progress in the CFE negotiations and talks. And the Vienna document is lingering. So that was well before the chairmanship of the OSCE. And then now we have the Steinmeier initiative, the Steinmeier proposal. So we continue with conventional arms control. And what he said is he included also cyber, drones, confidence building measure, everything what Wolfgang, what you said, we should not do, but that's what Steinmeier did, actually. And that was a very unconventional proposal. Okay? Let's try something very new. If we try something very new, we have to find a new format as well. So it might not be a continuation or a revival of the CFE talks. It might not even be a combination between CFE and the Vienna CSPM's talks. So, and if we talk about something new, and my reading of the Steinmeier proposal, I might be dead wrong, my reading of the Steinmeier proposal is that he stopped short of saying, look at the tactical nuclear weapons in Europe as well. And we all know the tactical nuclear weapons are there because of the conventional weapons and the conventional. There is a link between these non-strategic weapons and the conventional weapons. So my question would be, can there be any result of conventional arms talks if you don't address the tactical nuclear weapons as well?
Okay, thank you. I know there are other people who've asked for the floor, but we're really coming to the end of the session now. So I'm going to come back to the panelists, again, perhaps in reverse order, beginning with Wolfgang.
Thank you. I'll start with the first question. I think you have both in the OSCE context when you refer to principles. One is the principle of nations are free to decide about their security arrangements. So that means they can join an alliance or not, or stay neutral. On the other hand, there is no principle that alliances have to accept the application to join, because alliances have to be careful to look at the strategic environment and promote stability in Europe. And I say it because of certain regulations or agreements we have made in the early 90s that are probably forgotten. If you look at the first NATO enlargement after the Cold War, or at the end of the Cold War, it was indeed the German unification. It was not done without conditions. There is a legally binding conditions of the so-called 2+4 treaty that is the basis for the German unification, which says, yes, the Russian forces, first Soviet, then Russian, will leave Germany. At the same time, NATO will not take over the positions, the military positions that the Russians have left in the eastern part of Germany. So for Germany, it's legally binding that we do not station NATO forces in the country, so-called new Länder, what we call the countries of the former GDR and Berlin. This is that was the understanding of the 90s. We carried on this understanding when it came to the first or to the next enlargement in Central Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, then Czech and Slovak Republic and Hungary, where we said we will reassure the Russians because they were worried about or wary about undermining the acquis of 1990. Then we said we do three things to reassure you. First, we will strengthen the OSCE as our common roof. Second, we will take you closer to NATO. It later boiled down to the NATO-Russia Council. And third, we will adopt the CFE treaty because this bloc-to-bloc approach doesn't work anymore. So that was the agreement. And in the interim phase, we agreed we would not station substantial combat forces in brackets until this ACFE would have regulated territorial ceilings, which never occurred. So in other words, we are left at this point, but the NATO enlargement went further. So I would not say it's a matter of principles whether one can enlarge or not enlarge. The question is under which conditions one can or should enlarge. And these conditions, which we had embedded enlargement in the 90s in certain arrangements, and that path was left from 2001, I would guess 2002 onwards. And then the problem started, also in the context of other geopolitical rivalry. I'm not going to say who is wrong and right. This is also a question of perceptions, and it is futile to look at the past and then say, try to answer who is guilty. The fact is we are there. And now we have to cope with the situation we have arrived at, no matter what perception you have. And this is the context in which the Steinmeier Initiative said things have gone the wrong way. The security in Europe has become fragile. There is a risk of escalation. We should do something, and the best way to do something is to keep restraint. Of course, also to change policies, but there must be reassurances, also military reassurances. And here I come to the next point, which was made by you, Professor Gärtner, before. I don't believe that it was the intention of Mr. Steinmeier to put in tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, everything is linked to everything. We have a security environment which cannot be divided. And we all know that tactical nuclear weapons were there when we negotiated CFE. There was the INF Treaty first. We had several strategic treaties. And in this framework, we negotiated conventional arms control. Nobody says that when you negotiate conventional arms control, you forget about all the other areas. The question is it realistic to put in questions like cyber, and here I disagree, by the way, with the approach that was written. Cyber in the conventional arms control context. Yes, there is a context, but can you negotiate it there? We have a lot of instruments. Even the OSCE agreed on an instrument on cyber, not legally binding, of course, but at least something, more in a declaratory character. And you have other instruments, and this is a very shaky issue because we do not only talk about military when we speak about cyber. We speak about a net that is used predominantly by the civilian sphere. So we have a dual use thing. And this makes the things very problematic. The same is if your ambition is too high and you aim at net-centric warfare with all the assets, that means at satellites in the orbit, then you might cope with the fact that the CD in Geneva is talking about prevention of arms race in outer space, and where is then the limit? If you want to talk about everything in one framework, you might achieve nothing. So I guess a realistic approach is a parallel approach and confining conventional arms control to things that are conventional. And I would also warn against those who say these old conventional 5 types of treaty-limited equipments have no meaning anymore. It is not the case. Look at the conflict in Ukraine, in Syria, and in other parts of the world. these conflicts are fought with the traditional 5 TLE category type equipment. And what is NATO doing? Placing conventional armaments that are subject to the CFE treaty in the Baltic states and in Poland. And how is Russia reacting? With the same kind of TLE type beefing up of forces along borderlines. So I would want to go too far and have a more realistic approach on that. I would not agree with Alexander's notion that we have an unlimited arms race. As Adam pointed out, 4 battalions in the 4 NATO countries are not a threat to Russia and is not limited. And at least it is the Western perception. I agree that you might have another one, but the Western perception is that the West keeps the limits of the admittedly unspecified agreement in the NATO-Russia Founding Act that no additional substantial combat forces should be stationed. If I now would compare the Russian proposals, which I negotiated with the Russian delegates myself in the Joint Consultative Group, you would see that the current stationing doesn't exceed the Russian proposals.
Okay, thank you. Adam.
First of all, for the record, I disagree with Wolfgang on the history of NATO enlargement, and he knows that. I'm not going into the details.
That doesn't, I know it.
Now, Poirman, I think, referred once more to the incentives for the Russian Federation. Of course, there might be military and political incentives, and I was just, in my first answer, I was focusing on possible military incentives, or in other words, on things that militarily might be interesting for the Russian military to cover those issues with arms control. But by no means I'm not suggesting that. And of course, once more, we cannot, no arms control takes place in political vacuum. And there are quite important political factors here, which, by the way, make our discussion more difficult, because when our Russian colleague says that there is a value in dialogue, and what's wrong with having a dialogue? What's wrong with having a dialogue? Political context. Crimea, use of force, your narrative is different, but there are different narratives, the use of force, annexation of Crimea, and so on and so on. And the notion of dialogue, which will not be focused on issues on which we have a chance to agree on, or which we want to clarify, carries the notion of, okay, if we engage in dialogue, that we forget about anything else. And that's the problem with dialogue as such. And that's why this discussion about relaunching arms control politically is extremely important, but also difficult. I'm hesitating to say a bit artificial, but it is. Thank you.
Okay. Angela, final word.
Yeah, different perceptions. I think this is really, really important. It's not only the context, but it's also the different perceptions. And then I'm thinking again about the Baltics and whether or not you've got battalions stationed there. What it isn't always what actually happens, but it is how it is perceived by one side or the other. I think that is really important to keep in mind. It's not actually what's happening, but how do you perceive it? And I think that's something that has to be put on the table, and that also has to be talked about. And the other issue that I wanted to mention is that when you're thinking about incentives, it isn't only military incentives. I think security is not only limited to military interventions or military actions, but security is a lot more. And I'm looking at this. I've recently moved back to Europe after many years abroad, and the Europe that I grew up in is a very different Europe that I came back to. And what has happened over the last 30 years or 20 years or 10 years is really that there's a knitting together of particularly the European youth, if you think about Erasmus, etc. And that is something that is a very different engagement, that is a very different perception of how we all live together in the Western European world, and also the enlargement of the European Union, that what we have. What I would really like to see, I would like to see more engagement with Russia. And not only on the military side, but I think it has to go beyond. We talked about enlarging it, and maybe it's not enlarging it in terms of cyber or other issues, but also enlarging it in terms of an understanding that we need to come to. And when you think about 20, 30, 40 years ago, you had a lot of people who were so-called Sovietologists. This was something that was being studied. Who does that these days? How many people do you know, young people, who are actually pursuing that course of action? It just doesn't exist anymore. Adam said he went and studied in Moscow. How many people do you right now where there's an exchange in studying? I'm sorry, I mean, I'm enlarging it now, but I think security is too narrowly seen right now. It needs to be, in my opinion, it needs to be enlarged, it needs to be changed, and there needs to be a little bit of a, you know, kind of wrapping around the arms around this issue, not only from the military standpoint, but think a little bit beyond it. That, to me, is something that is very, very important, and I'd like to leave you from my side with that thought.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists, and to you for your patience and engagement. I'm sorry, no, the session has already run 10 minutes beyond its... No. Do we have until 45?
We have 6.5 minutes.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I thought we were finishing. Then, in that case, I know you've been very patient, so please, by all means. Yeah.
More coming.
PhD from University College Dublin. My research area is EU's export control policy worldwide. So that's why thank you so much. I would like to have only technical notes for Adam, especially because you mentioned about the terminology about the conventional arm control and the politicalized decision-making process. So actually, my whole research area is focusing on how to define the boundary between conventional arm and dual-use arms. Actually, so within the European Union, there is actually a limitation for the concept of arm munition and war material. It has been defined in Article 346, the exception, security exception clause in TFEU. It says that all the arm war material has been specified in armament list, which has never been updated since 1958. So it's actually there, and it's only it's like very conventional materials, like tank, or it's like those things that only exist in the Second War period, and that is why the dual-use thing that Richard has just mentioned has been launched in European area. It's like for all the WMD, it's like a nuclear and chemical and biology things. They has been put into the
I'm not quite
area.
sure where we're going with this. Is there a
So
question?
just a note that there is actually a concept for conventional arm in Europe, and if you want to add more things like the cyber things into the conventional arm, there might be legality issues at the international level, because normally country would only take unilateral actions when it's touched their essential security interest. But it's like country can't define or can't define themselves that these cyber or satellite things are actually touching their essential security interest, because there is no level play field for people to argue about that.
Do you wish to respond?
I don't know this document. Ask Wolfgang.
So that's fine. I was thinking I'm just making a note. And for another thing is the transparency. Actually, I think EU has already
there are other people who would also like to ask questions.
have
so.
one that
Yeah.
is called dual-use E6.
Yeah, thank you.
My name is Yorgos Levendis. I'm the director of International Security Forum from this small island of Cyprus, divided but nevertheless straddling 3 continents and being the springboard for security operations towards the troublesome region of the Middle East. I have not heard the word China in the discussion today, and I wonder if the panelists could comment on whether there is a role for China to play in the new security environment, given the increasing Russia-NATO confrontation and Moscow's perception of a common Eurasian security space.
Thank you. something?
Feel free to use my time. I have
Oh,
no idea
okay.
about China's role.
Does anyone on the panel have anything to?
From my best knowledge, from the time I served in the United Nations, I had a little bit to do with China. I think China is not directly involved in security matters in Europe. They might attentively look at it, but they stay out of any position. At least I'm not aware of that. But what comes to mind is, of course, that there is a certain concept to have closer ties with the Russian Federation and also to show some military muscles through exercises, but they take place basically in East Asia, with one exception that took place in the Mediterranean. So that just is a framework. When it comes to global security, apart from the role all P5 play, of course, in the Security Council, I think China was always involved in global instruments, and it's exactly the instruments Angela mentioned at the beginning. Whether it's small arms, the arms register, etc., etc. I always had to do with Chinese interlocutors, and sometimes I had the feeling that they took the principle. This is a late answer on the principle question. I didn't understand quite well which principles you refer to, whether international law or arms control principles. So when it came to transparency, the Chinese at the beginning said transparency is a very nice Western concept. Those who are strong can show the muscles. Those who are weak can only show their weaknesses. So, and the other answer was transparency is legalized espionage. From that position, China has departed for a long time, and they are now actively engaging in this kind of instruments that one has to acknowledge. So there seems to be a Chinese interest in multilateralism also in this area.
Angela, would you?
Let me just say something on the perspective from the United Nations. And I think it's very interesting what's happening with China. And China, for many years, until very, very recently, it was also like the G77 in China. And China was absolutely nowhere in terms of taking independent positions. And that's something that we really need to keep in mind. It has changed, though, in the last 2-3 years. And when you look at why it has changed, and I'm not talking about the European region, I'll come to that in a minute, but when you're looking at why it has changed, is primarily one aspect, to my interpretation in any case, and that is that China is now the third largest budget payer in the United Nations. That is absolutely amazing how quickly it's come up. Now, when you look at these rate increases, which are determined by member states, there's a committee that deals with that. They're usually about 5 years behind in the appreciation. And next year they will have another, quote, rate year, meaning that new rates are being set. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if China all of a sudden becomes, not all of a sudden, but then will become the number 2 payer of the budget of the United Nations. That changes your perception of what's happening. And when you see of where China has engaged, it's engaged in a major way in Africa, and I think that's largely part also in terms of having influence there, natural resources. But when it comes to Europe, there's always talk about the commercial relationships. But I think that in a way, what's happening in the South China Sea, it's quite convenient that you have a conflict in Europe that detracts from paying attention to other areas that might be conflict zones. And that is something that you also see very pronounced in a way. Now, what China has done is it has taken abstention positions, if I can call it that, in both in the Security Council and also in the General Assembly on issues that are maybe important to the United States and to the Western countries. And that is also not voting against it, but basically taking, again, more of a standoffish relation, if you so want, or position that I can see. But it is a very important development to watch what is happening once they do become, in the next couple of years, even more important from the budgetary point of view, and whether that will influence additional positions that they will take.
Okay. Thank you. Well, and thank you again to the panelists, and with apologies for my poor time management, though finishing a session 7 minutes early may have made me unique in this conference chairing business. But thanks again for your engagement, and thank you again to all of the panelists.